It's been a little over 20 years since we said our final goodbye to our favorite neighbor, Mr. Rogers. I think this is the perfect opportunity to honor the absolute legend of children's TV with some fun facts. After all, we could all use a little more Mr. Rogers in our lives these days. Anyway, without any further delay, here are 50 facts about Mr. Rogers. He made 895 episodes of Mister Rogers' Neighborhood, 912 if you include specials. It was the third longest running program in PBS history. This would take you 17 days, 2 hours, and 30 minutes to watch from start to finish.
But don't you want to watch something other than this, like, I don't know, Mr. Rogers?
On May 11, 2017, Twitch aired a Mister Rogers Neighborhood marathon. They aired nearly every single episode and it lasted 18 days. The toy town featured in the intro of Mister Rogers' Neighborhood is actually based on Mr. Rogers' real-life hometown of Latrobe, Pennsylvania. He actually disliked TV the first time he saw it. Mr. Rogers came home from college one day during his senior year and his family had one of the first TVs in town. He saw people throwing pies at each other and was baffled why a tool with so much potential was being wasted on this nonsense slapstick.
And I saw people throwing pies in each other's faces. And I thought, this could be a wonderful tool for education. Why is it being used this way?
He was bullied as a child. As a shy and chubby child, he was an easy target and was called Fat Freddy. This would become a pivotal period in Mr. Rogers' life. Although it was a painful experience, it taught him the importance of the expression of feelings. The adults around him would tell him to just ignore it and pretend he didn't care, but he did care. His strong connection to his own childhood made him such an effective teacher and one of the first champions of mental health on television.
The toughest thing is to love somebody who has done something mean to you, especially when that somebody has been yourself.
He was a sickly child suffering from both asthma and scarlet fever. In fact, there were health complications going all the way back to his birth. His mother, Nancy Rogers, had a difficult childbirth and the doctor advised his parents not to have a second child as it could be fatal. Mr. Rogers was an only child until the age of 11 when his parents adopted his sister Nancy Elaine Rogers. He stated that his parents had adopted Lainey as a sort of present for him since up until then Fred was a very lonely child. Mr. Rogers and Tom Hanks are sixth cousins. Although Tom Hanks played Fred Rogers in the 2019 film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, they never met according to his wife Joanne. She also said that Mr. Rogers loved Forrest Gump and that he must have seen it at least 40 times. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister. Although he never explicitly mentioned religion on the show in order to not exclude children, his strong Christian values were very present in his programming. He also studied and had an appreciation for other faiths such as Catholicism, Buddhism, Judaism, and more. The cardigan sweaters he wore on the show were hand-knit by his mom. His mother loved knitting and would always make sweaters for friends and family. Fred would get a new cardigan every year until she passed away in 1981.
And then she'd say, what kind do you all want next year? She said, oh, I know the kind you want, Freddie. You want the one with the zipper.
One of those sweaters now sits in the Smithsonian. Mr. Rogers donated the sweater to the museum in 1983. He was red-green colorblind. It's kind of ironic that he probably wasn't able to notice some of the colors in his extensive wardrobe. According to his son, everything looked brownish to him. He refused to market to children. In addition to demeaning people, one guaranteed way to set off Mr. Rogers was exploiting and taking advantage of children. He thought it was immoral to advertise to kids who couldn't tell the difference between a program and a commercial.
Child is appreciated for what he will be, not for what he is. He will be a great consumer someday.
This created issues with securing funding for his programming early on, but he stood his ground. Compare this with Sesame Street, which started a year after Mr. Rogers and was heavily marketed. Speaking of Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers appeared on an episode of Sesame Street and Big Bird appeared on an episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. The popular children's TV shows were a sort of yin and yang when it came to early childhood, with Mr. Rogers being slower and deliberate while Sesame Street was more fast-paced.
Sesame Street, of course, is just bang, 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 and yours was very calm, intelligent.
Mr. Rogers focused more on social and emotional development, while Sesame Street focused more on cognitive learning, such as teaching the alphabet and numbers. But both shows were praised for raising the standard for children's programming.
Bye, Mr. Rogers!
A Yale study actually showed that kids who watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood were able to retain more information than those who watched Sesame Street and were also more patient. He loved fart jokes. His wife once mentioned in an interview that he loved making her laugh at boring parties by ripping a fat one. It certainly was a bootyful day in the neighborhood.
I seem to smell something. Has Prince Tuesday done poo-poo in his diaper?
I'm sorry, I can't get over this one. I'm just trying to picture it in my head.
There, that smells better.
He composed over 200 songs and 13 operas. He had a bachelor's degree in music while his wife had a master's degree in music. He went to school with Arnold Palmer. The popular Arizona drink and occasional golfer once said that Mr. Rogers wasn't the most athletically inclined person after his dad gave him a golf lesson.
Oh, too far.
He was enrolled at Dartmouth College. He would only last a year before transferring to Rollins College to pursue music. Mr. Rogers was miserable at Dartmouth. He wasn't particularly a good fit for the Ivy League party school. The first show he was featured in was called The Children's Corner. He had an off-screen role producing the music and handling the puppets. The introduction and use of puppets actually happened by accident. The Children's Corner didn't have a high budget, so they relied quite a bit on free footage.
So I just combed the country for free films that we could put in.
The film would break off, and since it was old and brittle, so Fred improvised with puppets to fill in the gaps while they fixed the footage. The puppets featured in the neighborhood of Make-Believe were named after various members of his family, but they each represented different aspects of Fred's personality. If he needed to be an authoritative figure, he would use King Friday. If he wanted to say something a bit more risque, he would use the mean-spirited Lady Elaine. But the puppet that best represented his inner child was the shy Daniel Striped Tiger.
Daniel was pretty much Fred. He did all the voices, but I think Daniel was the real Fred.
He discussed serious topics like death, divorce, disabilities, and disasters. Instead of shying away from these issues, he knew kids had questions about these things. He didn't offer an easy fix, but he let the kids know that it was okay to share their feelings to get through difficult times.
What does assassination mean?
He asked Burger King to take down a parody ad. Mr. Rogers didn't like the idea of his likeness being used to mislead children into buying burgers. He generally had a great sense of humor and was cool with the countless parodies of him unless it insulted his philosophy. He thought many of the parodies were done with good intentions.
It's a beautiful day to kick your ass.
Mr. Rogers got on the phone with Burger King's senior vice president of marketing and they chatted a bit about being a parent. He asked him what he would think if his own kids misunderstood what he did and thought he was doing something harmful. The ad was taken down a week after it aired and cost Burger King $150,000.
It's Mr. Rogers there in the on the left.
While he didn't sue Burger King, he did actually sue the KKK. In 1990, the Ku Klux Klan in Missouri was using telephone recordings that contained songs similar to the ones on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, as well as a voice that imitated Mr. Rogers' way of speaking. The KKK was using his likeness to say extremely racist things. It was one of the few times he actually sued. I can't believe they would use his voice to get their message across.
I like you just the way you are, but I'd like you even more if you subscribe to Know This Is Alex.
He responded to all fan mail. Sometimes he and his wife would spend long evenings at the kitchen table going through the letters from kids and parents. Eventually the amount of fan mail became too much, so he hired help to go through them, but he still read, edited, and signed each one. Makes me wish I wrote a letter back in the day. He was fluent in French and also studied Spanish, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and American Sign Language. At Rollins College, he minored in French and even spent a summer in France to hone the language. It was during this trip where he and his family informally adopted a French orphan, paying for his education.
Très bien, merci. Et vous comme moi?
His kindness extended to animals as well. He met Koko the Gorilla in a 1998 episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Koko and the other gorillas at the San Francisco Zoo would often watch the show. She was a big fan of Mr. Rogers. When she saw him, she held him in her arms, and in typical Mr. Rogers fashion, she began taking off his shoes. Koko also taught Mr. Rogers some sign language, including how to say her favorite color red. The episode was intended to teach kids to appreciate animals and wildlife, but Koko ended up being the one appreciating Mr. Rogers. He was immortalized in stamp form in 2018. The stamp features his trademark red cardigan sweater and King Friday the 13th. He used sneakers to literally sneak around the set since they were quieter than his dress shoes.
I started wearing these things so that I could run from one end of the studio to the other, from the organ to the puppet stage, and that's why I wore sneakers.
He appeared before Congress to save funding for public television. President Nixon was looking for ways to save money to fund the Vietnam War, and he had public television funding in his sights in 1969. It was up to Mr. Rogers to convince the hard-ass Senator John Pastore that public television was worth saving.
I'm very much concerned, as I know you are, about what's being delivered to our children in this country.
Using his soft-spoken tone, he was able to tug at Pastore's heartstrings and disarm the room full of politicians. He was successful and secured $20 million in funding for PBS.
I end the program by saying, you've made this day a special day by just your being you.
I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
He also appeared before the Supreme Court to defend the use of VCRs to record TV. In a copyright infringement case between Sony and Universal Studios, Mr. Rogers argued in favor of the use of VCRs to record shows. He believed families should be able to watch his show when it suited them best. He stated, "I am opposed to people being programmed by others." One of his most memorable quotes came from his grandfather, Fred McFeely. "You've made this day a special day by just your being you." Mr. Rogers was named after his grandfather, and Fred also named the speedy delivery mailman, Mr. McFeely, on the show after him. He would end each episode by saying this quote to to the audience.
My grandfather's name was Mr. McFeely, and I always remember he said to me, "You've made this day a special day, Freddie, by just your being yourself." And that's always been with me.
He was very careful and specific with his wording. He didn't want to confuse or scare children because he knew that they interpreted things literally. Those who worked on the show coined the term Fredditch to describe Mr. Rogers' specific way of script writing. He consulted childhood development experts for his show. At first glance, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood may seem very simple with its slow-paced talking and long periods of silence, but that was intentional. That's what the latest research would say was most beneficial for a young child's developing mind. He would often speak with Dr. Margaret McFarland from the University of Pittsburgh for approval and insight on scripts and topics. His desire to meet the highest standards was to the detriment of the show at times, as he would sometimes leave production on hold to go consult with the doctor if he felt the content was lacking. They worked together for 30 years before Dr. McFarland passed away in 1988. Before Hollywood would come knocking on their door, actor Michael Keaton and filmmaker George Romero both got their start working on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Keaton was a stagehand and operated the trolley, while Romero filmed some shorts for the show, including Mr. Rogers Gets a Tonsillectomy. Angela Santomero was the creator of Blue's Clues and the Mr. Rogers spin-off Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. She was heavily influenced by Mr. Rogers growing up. Many aspects from Blue's Clues were drawn from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, most notably the slower-paced style and how the host would address a single audience member who was watching at home.
And he always wore the sweater. That was a ritual that was anticipated by the home viewer, so I always wore the same shirt, that sort of thing. And he would take an idea from the beginning of the show and explore it in an imaginative realm with the trolley, and I would skidoo someplace, so we were deliberately, drawing from the best.
He took a stance against racism. Francois Clemens was brought in to play a police officer during a time when racial tensions were high. A week after the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Mr. Rogers and Officer Clemens shared a small pool in an episode of The Neighborhood. During this time, segregation was still very much alive, and Mr. Rogers was not having it.
When Fred asked me to be a police officer, Fred, are you sure? Do you know what policemen represent in the community where I was raised?
His favorite quote was, "What is essential is invisible to the eye."
But the older I get, the more important I know that is. Because what we see is rarely what is essential. What's behind your face is what's essential.
He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2002.
His program helps children understand caring, safety, and respect for others, and his legendary commitment to young people has been an enriching part of American life.
The only time he played a part other than Mr. Rogers was on Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. The real-life minister would play the part of Reverend Thomas.
It's the people who are the church.
Won't You Be My Neighbor Day is celebrated on March 20th to honor Mr. Rogers on his birthday. It was taken from Sweater Day, which was meant to celebrate what would have been his 80th birthday on March 20th, 2008. He was very frugal. Although he came from a rich family, he was quite the penny pincher. Far from being a Scrooge, he actually paid his staff well. And his tax attorneys even had to pressure the Fred Rogers Company to pay him a higher salary in order to avoid raising eyebrows over at the IRS. He lived in Canada for 3 years to start Mr. Rogers, the predecessor to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and for the first time he was featured on screen as the host. During his time working on the Children's Corner and Mr. Rogers, he would develop the idea of what he wanted Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to be like. His final television appearance took place on the first anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. He delivered a series of TV promos addressing families and offering comfort during the difficult period. The final episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood aired in August of 2001, a month before the 9/11 attacks.
That we will do all we can to keep them safe in any scary time. I'm always glad to be your neighbor.
He was a vegetarian. He has stated that he couldn't eat anything that had a mother.
So I said to somebody, I had heard that fish was very good for you. And that person said, yeah, but it's not good for the fish.
He was straight edge. He didn't drink or smoke or have any vices really. He maintained a weight of 143 pounds every day of his life since the 1950s. He was an avid swimmer, and every morning before his swim, he weighed himself, and sure enough, the scale would show 143. 143 was also a personal numerology that represented the letters it took to say I love you. 143.
Y-O-U, I love you.
He passed away on February 27, 2003 from stomach cancer, despite his healthy diet and workout regimen. Unfortunately, most cases of stomach cancer are not diagnosed until the cancer is spread, which was the case with Mr. Rogers. His legacy lives on through Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. Although Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood stopped airing reruns in the late 2000s, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood picks up where it left off to teach a whole new generation of children the values that Fred Rogers lived by. Over 4 generations of children that watch Mr. Rogers can rest easy knowing that part of Fred is still teaching kids to be kind to each other, share their feelings, and that most importantly, that they are loved for who they are.
And I like you as you are. And children need to hear that. I don't think that anybody can grow unless he really is accepted exactly as he is.
So how did you do? Even if you knew all 50 facts, I hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane and remembered the impact that Mr. Rogers left. There are countless fun facts about Mr. Rogers, so comment down below any I may have not included and let me know what your favorite memory of Mr. Rogers is. Now that you know the facts, we can tackle some of the dirty rumors that were spread about the American icon, like how he was allegedly a Navy SEAL in the Vietnam War, or how he hid his military tattoos under his sweater. In that video over there. I'll see you over there, neighbor.
Would you just take, along with me, 10 seconds to think of the people who have helped you become who you are? 10 seconds of silence. I'll watch the time. Whomever you've been thinking about, how pleased they must be to know the difference you feel they've made.